Hello, hello. How's everyone doing? More than that. Come on. I have an ego. Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's a beautiful, Friday? It's a beautiful Friday afternoon. My name is Paula Croxon, and I am the Director of Public Programs at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, which is where we are. But we're also live streaming. That's why I'm talking weirdly like this. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this very fabulous, very special event with our jazz artist in residence, Miguel Zenón. And he is going to be joined today by the very amazing, very talented Gilmore. And the equally amazing, equally talented Jennifer Scribner. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Miguel. We're going to enjoy some jazz and science and all sorts of amazing things about the mind and rhythm. Take it away.
Yeah, maybe this is a little hot. Thank you so much. It's great to be here and great to play and to have you here just to share some music and thoughts with. I want to thank Marcus for being here. It's always such a privilege to get to make music with him. So the idea today is to, of course, play some music and share music, but also talk a little bit about rhythm and the way we think about rhythm, and from our perspective as musicians, but think about what happens in our body and our mind when we think about rhythm and we express rhythm in different ways. And we'll have some people here, I'm sure, who can help us explore that from the other side of things. But I guess I wanted to start by maybe having Marcus share a little bit of his experience. You know, one of the things that I feel is really interesting as a musician, and I know we have a lot of musicians here, musically inclined folks, is, you know, when we start thinking about rhythm, both conceptually as performers and also just as an expression of ideas and feelings, you know, be it with dance or performance or different things. And I guess, Marcus, I'll just start by asking maybe a little bit about pulse, you know, just to start, and maybe as a way to take a step back for a second. For me personally, when I think about rhythm, and a lot of times I like to think about rhythm in terms of layers, something that's based on different layers, you know, rhythm in the context of music, that is. So when I think about pulse would be that sort of anchor layer where everything else is sort of put on top, you know. So we're playing boom, 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 bing, bing, boom, bing, bing, boom. So this is my pulse, right? This is like my anchor, and then everything else is kind of happening on top of that, be it a subdivision of 2 or 3s or 4s, and then we create, by using those subdivisions, we sort of create a rhythmic melody or a groove, right? That's kind of what we were trying to do now anyway. So I would love to talk to Marcus first of all about pulse from the perspective of you as a drummer, and then also pulse in terms of like you know, of context, because Marcus, of course, I mean, is an amazing drummer who's done a lot of different things, a lot of things that have more to do with things that are based on things coming from the jazz world and things coming from a non-jazz, maybe more groove-oriented music. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts about some of these ideas, Marcus. Yeah. With the mic would be great.
Hello. Okay. So you want me to talk about pulse, or?
Yeah. Maybe you give us a little insight on your mind.
Yeah. I mean, pulse is for me, that's the aspect of you know, when you're listening to music that might be considered like more metric based music. Pulse is, for me, usually the foundation of the music, and everything kind of comes out of that. So pulse is the first thing that I gravitate towards. Typically, if I'm listening to something or if I'm playing something and I want to have an understanding of what I'm working with, I usually try to understand the very first thing you want to understand is the pulse.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, like, you know, when we think about pulse and we think about groove and things like that, how does that, you know, how, I guess my question would be, how conscious of an attempt is that? You know, like nowadays, for you, you've been playing for a while and you've been exposed to music since you were very, very young. So how conscious is that attempt, or is it more like let me just kind of feel it out and see, you know?
Yeah, usually it's more of innate feeling, you know. I mean, I can sit back and try to analyze it maybe later after the fact, but usually the initial understanding of the rhythm is really based on a feeling. And I say, okay, that's probably the pulse. That's the pulse, right? That's how I'm feeling it, at least.
Yeah.
And then I can kind of take it from there.
Right.
So sometimes it's conscious, but a lot of times it's not really so conscious. You know?
I see. So this piece that we played is a piece by Fela Kuti, a musician from Nigeria, very well known, and sort of like almost, I won't say created, but sort of developed this Afrobeat sort of sound that was like funk oriented with a lot of things that were more folkish, West African sounds. And this piece is called Black Man's Cry. So I was talking to Marcus about the piece, and we never really played it together. We both listened to it and try to figure out how to react to it. But for example, Marcus, when you were playing this groove just now, and we're talking about Tony, Fela's drummer who played with him for a long time, and also kind of created a sound like this sound, so how much do you have to think about it and like stylistically, for example, how conscious is that thought, like, okay, so I'm playing like an Afrobeat thing versus a funk versus an R&B versus a jazz groove.
Yeah, well, it's all contingent on what we're playing, but since we were playing this piece, I've been a fan of Tony Allen's for some time, and Fela Kuti, so I'm somewhat familiar with the music that they were making, especially in the 70s, Africa 70. That was the main ensemble I listened to that Tony was very much a part of. So that music and that sound has been influential on me. So when you said you wanted to play this tune, I was like, okay, I have some understanding of where it's coming from, the context and everything. So when we play it, it'll be informed by that. So
yeah. And so one of the things that I like to think about a lot for this type of things, and we were talking a little bit about this before. So we talked about pulse as sort of like one layer, and subdivision as another layer. But then within those subdivisions, there's different ways to sort of interact. Like for those musicians here, if we're thinking about a quarter note or a half note, and then we say 16 notes or 8 notes in between, those 8 notes could be felt differently, right? It could be a little more strong, a little more straight, a little in between, like playing this, for example, the sort of like 8 note feel is very specific, right? Is different than if you were playing like a funk beat or something like that.
For sure. Although there's something in the, you can say it's 8th note based, right? But there's a, naturally, of course, there's a swing to it. All this music has a swing to it. And I feel like specifically with Tony Allen's touch, it's a, I don't think of it as like an exaggerated swing. So most people would kind of say it's more like 8th note bass. But there are some people that actually play, when they play some kind of straight ahead music, their cymbal beat is kind of more in alignment with the 8th note that Tony's playing versus other drummers,
Would you mind
yeah, sure.
demonstrating a little bit?
Because even Tony, even a lot of that music, they're still playing that that kind of 3-beat pattern. Something's playing that pattern. Sometimes it's Tony, and sometimes it's like the percussion or something. But they're still, when I say the 3-beat pattern, I mean, and I think it's in this tune as well, right? Yeah.
Like something that's kind of underlined.
Exactly. It's a foundation. Yeah, for sure. And there are some people that would play a cymbal beat at that tempo, like. But there are other people that will play, which is more, maybe a little bit more straight, not quite as swung, but Tony's playing right in that same kind of pocket, so
right,
it is connected. I mean, we could talk about this all day actually, because it gets real deep. Because then I started thinking about a lot of the drummers born in the 40s. Which I believe Tony was, Janguito, right? Janguito. Like a lot of cats from all over the world, because the drum set became more of like obviously the drum is an ancient instrument in a lot of cultures, but the drum set became more popular in other cultures. So there's like drum set language kind of expanded in a very specific kind of way, I think, due to a lot of the drummers born in the 40s,
So, for example, when you were just demonstrating now, and this is kind of getting into the zone, leaving the pole zone and thinking more about subdivision, which is, this is the kind of stuff that I'm like really uber interested on, as you know, Mike and Mark and a lot of the people here know just from the questions that I keep asking all the time. It's like, what happens when we sort of like, you know, sort of subdivide things in a very specific way to make that type of shift, like what you just did, for example, from playing something that was a little like straighter to playing something that was a little more swung out, you know, and how we think about it. You know, we were talking about this just before this, like, you know, like when we sort of like formalize a groove or drum beat, you know, where it's like, you know, if you go most places in the world, they'll have drum music. It's an ancient instrument, like Marcus said. And most places when they play this drum music, they're not thinking about like meter or pulse or anything. It's just kind of, you know, it just kind of happens. It's connected to the culture and it's an expression of everyday life. But, you know, you could also go in that direction and say, you know, let me just kind of formalize this. What is this? You know, what is it? Is it, you know, a little, you know, like 4 against 5 or 4 against 3, or, you know, is it something that's kind of cross? Is it like more triplety or more 8-note bass? So Marcus has been playing since he was a very young person. He comes from a family of musicians, and I want to talk about this a little later too. I'm assuming that your experience initially was more like just kind of listening and replicating what you heard.
Yeah. My earliest, before I was formally trained or anything, I just played what I heard, and you know, the early sounds that I heard were the music of my parents. You know, a lot of music in church, gospel, but then also, you know, Earth, Wind and Fire, the music that they grew up with, and then also the music of other members of my family. So some more experimental stuff with my uncles playing with Sun Ra and Uncle Graham, and then also my grandfather, of course, going to his shows at a very young age. So these are all a part of my musical foundation, and it was just, you know, real. My connection with it was very intuitive, you know, like
right.
that's just all I knew, really.
Right.
So.
But then eventually there was a point where music became something that was formalized.
Yes,
and you knew what a quarter note was and what a triplet was.
I learned notations and everything.
So how was that transition? That's something that I find interesting. That transition from like music just being like this sort of like language to communicate to something that's a little more, you know, more formalized. And now you can think about a cymbal beat, you know, and 8 notes versus triplets or something like that. Yeah,
I mean, I kind of started getting into that a little bit just from talking to certain people, but really it was when my mother enrolled me in this program. It was like a Saturday program at Juilliard for young kids, and that's where I got the formal training. I learned about, you know, European classical notation and, you know, rudiments, and I started learning how to play the xylophone. You know, in the house, all I really had were hand drums and piano, so it was like mostly percussion. But you know, when I got to this program, I started learning about other types of percussion, you know, mostly European classical based. So yeah, notation, all that stuff, music theory, all that stuff kind of came into play at that point.
So kind of going back to my subdivision question, when you play that beat, that cymbal beat, how much of it are you sort of like analyzing, and how much of it is it just like, let me just stretch it out, you know, feel wise?
You mean like when I play cymbal beats, or when I just did it?
Yeah, like
when I just did it, I was trying to make an example, so I was being very intentional with making a clear contrast between one type of rhythmic, you know, essentially the same beat, but like, you know, playing it two very different ways, you know.
Right. But if you were playing something like, you know, if I asked you to play something that was more straight ahead and it was more swung, you're not necessarily thinking triplets, you're thinking more feel.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely not thinking triplets, man. no, definitely feel. Yep.
Which is interesting to me. I mean, for me, you know, Marcus grew up with a lot of this music. In my case, it was a little different. Like I wasn't exposed to jazz early. I was exposed to different types of music, but my experience with jazz came a lot later. So for me, it was a lot more formalized. You know, whereas like I was thinking, okay, so if I'm gonna play an 8 note here, it has to be more swung, or it has to be more triplet, oriented, and then trying to find a way to almost coming from the opposite direction in a way, like it's in terms of jazz, for example, like coming from a more formal thing into like, let's just kind of feel it out and see what happens. There was something I was asking you before, and it has to do with this idea of groove and subdivision. And we'll talk about some of this grooves. I'm thinking of one specifically. It's
Oh, you're talking about, okay.
Yes, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
it's like something where like you it's like formalizing a pulse, but then it has this maybe 5s or 7s, something like
stuff with Vijay, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He had Vijay Iyer had a lot of when I first started playing with him, I was exposed to some different approaches to the rhythm that I wasn't familiar with. So it was a great experience for me to kind of get into this find like a new pocket in the music. You know what I mean? It's something that was new to me. And he a lot of times he would write these tunes where they had like a lot of small subdivisions. Right. So the pulse, for the most part, might feel pretty typical. But it's the asymmetrical stuff in between each pulse. There's a lot of, might be like 7 beats in between each pulse.
I see.
But like really fast.
I see. Right.
So like you can kind of stretch it a little bit and make it just sound like what people would assume to be like typical, 4/4 or whatever. Or you can like really try to play each one, and then people will probably, I don't know what people hear, but I would imagine they could hear like the pulse, but they might say, well, this is a little different though. It sounds a little off, but it's you can still kind of wrap your ear around the general pulse.
Would you mind maybe
playing something like that? Okay, all right. Yeah, so
doesn't have to be that.
Okay. Do you want to play that? Okay. Man, it's been a long time since I played that stuff. But actually, I used to live over here when I played. Okay, so here's one that's like you can kind of feel it in 4 big beats, but it's really 5 in between each one, and then you can kind of create cross rhythms of 5 like on top of it. But yeah. Going back and forth between playing like I guess 5/16 notes and then 5/8 notes.
Yeah, and I'm assuming this is not going away over.
Everybody's musician in here.
I know we have some musicians. We have some non-musicians. But I guess if we were gonna step it back a little bit, what Marcus is trying to demonstrate is this idea of having a pulse, which is the first thing we were talking about, something that's steady, tune, tune, tune. And then what happens inside of the pulse could be 3.
I can just play a bunch of different. So it could be like what most people are probably familiar with is something like this. That's pretty typical, right? It could be. That's 7. The last one was 7. So then,
Yeah, that's so great.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting to me about this is the context that he's putting it on. He's putting it in this context that's very familiar for all of us. Boom, bop, boom, bop, boom, bop. And then the subdivision, in this case, if he does something complex, I mean complex in terms of like unfamiliar, let's say that way, like 5 or 7, which is like maybe less common in the kind of music that we might listen to on the radio or whatever, we still feel boom, 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 boom. So what you're playing, you know, with the 5s and the 7s and all that stuff, it almost like kind of finds its way into fitting into the 4, which is kind of what you were saying before. It kind of depends on what you want to hear. Like right. For this complexity, you kind of have to be looking for it in a way.
Yeah,
you know?
and also, at least in the context that I was playing with Vijay, you know, once I knew what the general foundation and form was of the composition, I could stretch things and, you know, do all kind of weird things in between, because once we understand the form, then we can play with it more. So I like to spend a lot of time doing that. If I knew what the form was, sometimes I would stretch it into other metric things, or sometimes more non-metric, just more fills, you know, but still following that same, keeping that same underlying pulse the same. So there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, that's so great. So Marcus, I'll ask you. I mean, we talked about Marcus's family, not a detail. Marcus's grandfather is Roy Haynes, probably one of the greatest living musicians today, and one of the, you know, bastions of the drum set in history, not just jazz history. Truly one of the great jazz revolutionaries and musicians that we've been able to experience through the short history of this music. And he's around still, 97, right? Still playing. Marcus was showing me a video before. It's pretty incredible. So, you know, I was talking to Paula and Jennifer also the other day about, you know, genetics and the kind of stuff that gets sort of passed down, you know, and we can get into some of that stuff later. But you mentioned, you know, Graham, and I know you have other people in your family, like your mom and other people who, you know, have music around all the time. And you already mentioned that you were really exposed to music early, but a lot of people are exposed to music early, right? And not all of them, you know, get to be amazing drummers like yourself. So I'm wondering, you know, especially in the case of Roy, how much of an effect that had. Of course, that affected, you know, you wanted to play music and wanted to go into that route, but in terms of a musical conception, right? And how much do you think was already there, you know, somehow, just from, you know, your family and genes and that stuff, and how much was it just like being exposed?
I don't know. I mean, I like to think that that I was born with like a natural affinity for the music, and I guess, you know, you can attribute that to, I don't really know how it works with DNA or anything, but I feel like, you know, I feel like I was born with a natural affinity for the music for sure, and that's one of my, you know, purposes being here. But of course, being actually exposed to the music, you know, it's one thing if I had this musical family, but I wasn't around them growing up, then I'd probably be in a very different situation right now. So actually, just the fact that I was able to be around them, and you know, able to watch them do that on a, you know, fairly regular basis, which is paramount for my development, of course, you know. And you know, and then of course I also had to have discipline to focus my energy to, like, you know, get better and find out, you know, what I needed to work on, and I would always ask questions, but most importantly, I would just observe. A lot of times, a lot of my learning was kind of silent. I was just observing. So,
and related to Roy specifically, for example, did you ever like sit down and talk to him specifically about drums, like how do you do this, how do you do that, or was it more like just?
Nah, yeah. See, I would talk with him. I spent a lot of time with him because we were always pretty close. And sometimes we would end up talking about music quite a bit. But in terms of like technical aspects of the drum set or anything, I didn't really ask him that many questions. I just kind of let him talk whenever he felt inclined to talk about whatever. And I just, you know, And then I would ask him questions. The kind of questions that I would ask most of the time was more related to other things, like what was it like playing gigs in the 40s? You know what I mean? Like, just a lot of things that he had to deal with that I can't even really fathom. I know my history, but I don't know what it's like to actually be there. I didn't live it. You know what I mean? So it's different when I can talk to somebody about these kind of things. And of course, I had the records to reference, so I had all that, and I could be like, oh, what was it like to play this game? Do you remember playing this, or or do you just remember it from the recording? Or talking about other aspects of the drums, like how the drums developed over the years and how they've changed, and do you prefer old drums or new drums, stuff like that. I could geek out over that type of stuff a lot. But yeah, I wasn't like, what technique are you using when you? I didn't ask those kind of questions. Yeah.
Which kind of, for me, is just great to hear this stuff, because it makes me think a lot about the way we learn, and the way we kind of sort of subtract information and kind of make it work for us. Now, I met Marcus. You were probably in high school when I met you, like
Steve,
first time with Steve Steve Coleman, common friend, amazing musician.
Was that in the?
He was like at this sort of informal jam session.
Cross-cultural, the Cultural Arts Center in 50-something Street, right?
Yeah. And I remember Marcus was kind of sitting
15,
in the corner, like he was there with Graham, his uncle, and we were all playing, and you were just sitting, like checking it out.
Yeah, I'm used to doing that. I was like, I could just chill and just watch.
And then I remember going home, and the next day talking to Steve, like, you remember that kid that was there? He played at the end. It was like incredible. It was like this virtuosic drummer. And I kept thinking, but man, that kid looked like he was like 12 years old. you might maybe you were a little older.
I was probably like 14 or 15. Yeah. I was a sophomore. I think I just started my sophomore year in high school.
Yeah, but this
14 maybe. Yeah.
Your description of the way you kind of absorb this information makes me think a lot about, like learning in a very sort of specific way, by observing, by imitating, by sort of like, when you were talking to Roy, for example, about his experiences, and trying to absorb what those experiences were and how they informed his playing, instead of just asking him, like, how do you play this triplets, or how do you, how do you do this thing on the hi-hat. It was more about observing and thinking about the experience, which is very, like, pretty, like, for me, pretty, the greatest way to learn, if you will, about anything. Really, just by observing, and the way it's been done in most cultures and societies in the world, So Marcus, I was hoping that before maybe we bring Jennifer up and maybe open it up, we could maybe play something solo on the drums for us without telling us much, just kind of see where it goes.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
That was awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much. I want to invite Jennifer up to join us. Jennifer Scribner. So some of you might know these are Jennifer's drums and cymbals. She's another fellow musician. You know, there's so many musicians here. I was talking to Mike before. It's really amazing to me. Like everyone I meet plays something, which is inspiring and great. You know, Jennifer, I was hoping maybe we could talk a little bit with Marcus also about, you know, as a percussionist and also a scientist, talk about this idea of you know, connecting, you know, with the instrument, connecting with the idea of creating rhythm, and a lot of the other things that we talked about, like you know, how we kind of express all this through improvisation and combination of different things. Maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, it sounds great. I have to say, just I am so honored to be able to join this conversation with you and with Marcus. It's a real pleasure. Thank you all for being here. As Miguel mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist in Richard Axel's lab, and I'm also a percussionist. It's interesting, my early training was more jazz focused, but then in college I really focused on classical, and I'm more up to speed on classical these days. My kit practicing is a little low, but yeah, it's nice to hear you play, Marcus. So, you know, there's so many different angles we could go, but one thing that I was thinking a lot about in terms of pulse is, as a percussionist, and Marcus, I'm interested in your thoughts here, like in my training and in my practicing, the sense of touch and also proprioception, this idea of where you are in space, is so critical, especially as a drummer, because that's the only way we can get different sounds out of an instrument. And, you know, just that awareness of like how far you are from the drum and pulling sounds out of it really has a lot to do with like how we play, how we keep a pulse, how we subdivide a pulse. So I think one experiment I'd love to do, this isn't my field, but I'm really interested in this notion of like the proprioceptive feedback that goes into, you know, producing the different sounds. Like Marcus, you're just able to get like a wonderful array of sounds out of a drum, and that's not easy to do. And so then we can also go into the other area that I'm interested in, innate versus learned behaviors, and like how much of it is just an innate, your ability to keep a pulse, but then, you know, I certainly find when I'm rusty, my sense of where I am in relation to the drum gets a little off if I'm not practicing regularly. So that's some of the ideas I've had. A lot of research studies that look at timing and beat, though, tend to rely on using the visual system, because we, as neuroscientists, we know a lot about that, the motor system, because we know a lot about that. So I'm throwing it out to people who study touch, like get in touch with that side of research.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering, Marcus, if that's something that, you know, now that we kind of have it from this perspective, is that something that you deal with sometimes on your own kind of practice? I mean, I know this is not your set, for example, and this is most of the time you don't play your set, right? Which is like probably 98% of the time you're not playing your drum sets. You have to adapt to specific resonance or specific kind of sound, like bounce back from the instrument, and a specific type of sound. Even if it's something similar to what you have at home, is still different, right? But what's really interesting about I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting is this idea that the drums are such a physical instrument, right? It's like everything you're doing is like a movement, and it's like a coordinated thing between this and that and all the limbs and all those things. You know, I'm wondering how much how much this plays into performance or practice, you know, as you work on the set and work on things, you know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, touch is that's one of the most important things. I mean, you know, touch and subsequently your sound. You know what I mean? That's something that I've always put a lot of energy into recognizing and into developing for myself. And like you said, a lot of times is a very good portion of the times where I'm in a situation where I have to play an instrument that is not mine. Sometimes a good amount of the time I at least have my cymbals. Today I don't have anything except for my sticks. So, I spent a lot of time, even now, but like even in like the very beginning, on really developing different sounds out of each instrument. Because that's another thing. Like the drum set is comprised of a lot of different instruments. I mean, different types of drums, but also cymbals, which aren't really drums, but it's percussion. So there's a different kind of vibration and a different, the way the harmonics and everything resonates is pretty different than the drum. So, you have to spend a lot of time with the drums and with the cymbals. And, and you're mostly playing them with sticks. So you guys spend a lot of time with sticks too. There's all the technical aspects of how you're holding the stick that can really inform, really play a large role in the sound that you're drawing out of the instrument.
Right.
So
I was gonna say when you said touch and Jennifer mentioned this word touch, this term, a lot of times something I've noticed, like when drummers and percussionists they say touch, a lot of times they really mean like the sound you get when you strike the drum with the stick, right? So it could be the same drum, the same stick, and depending on your touch, right? Depending
somebody
on
else can play the same thing and it sound very different.
It's gonna sound very different, right?
Yep.
So
then of course there are different sticks as well, but even just like touch is really in your hand, right?
Yes.
Or in your limbs, because the drum set you got to play with your feet too. So touches, the touch is in your toes and in your fingers.
Right. So it's a very like physical kind of connection over here, and then like a lot of physical movement, a lot of Like I always think like it requires so much strength,
Yeah, it's interesting because it's very specific type of muscles that you use to do these things, and even from going to play like one type of music to another, it could be like a slightly different set of muscles. Because I've spent some time, I've had some periods where maybe all kind of variations. Let's say I was playing in smaller ensembles. Maybe let's say at one point I remember I played with Vijay when I first started playing with him in like 2003. And, we're playing that music. And then I'd turn around and do like a big band gig with Clark Terry. And that's a whole different vibe. And there's more like a different type of ride cymbal playing. You know what I mean? And it's a big band. Or let's say another time I remember playing something like what would be seen as more of like, fusion rock or something like that. And so it's loud music, so it requires like a lot of endurance and power, but there's still like no real like ride cymbal like tipping. So you would think that after playing this kind of music for like a week or two on tour, then I come back and do some kind of straight ahead gig and maybe my chops would be like really on top. But no, because you're using different muscles. So even though it's louder music, I'm still not doing this. And that requires a very specific like set of muscles just to do that. So it can be a little tricky sometimes going back and forth between different types of music and using different muscles, and you would think that you need to use more muscles for one gig and more than the other gig, but actually it's just a different set of muscles sometimes.
So the difference was more physical than creative. Like you felt like creatively you were going mostly for the same things, but it was you were having to hit things harder or.
Well, I was hitting things harder, playing louder, but I wasn't. In terms of a physical aspect, I wasn't really just playing like, fast cymbal beats. To play a ride cymbal beat, like even if you're playing a slow tempo, it's still kind of a lot of beats per measure, right? Versus just playing just straight quarter notes or whatever. So something like that kind of caught me off guard. I remember a few times. Or anyway, we could talk about touch though forever. Because then you also have, with the piano player, I feel like they don't have as many aspects of the instrument that they can kind of modify before a gig versus us. At least we can tune, that's about it, I guess. We could tune, or we could prepare it. I guess it would be like prepared piano. We could put stuff on the drums. Yeah, stuff on the cymbals and stuff. But aside from that, then it's just all on you. So
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about. I'm thinking in terms of the science that we all think about is like the context. We use the word context a lot as far as defining like the environment that an experiment is being conducted, and I think it comes to play in music as well. So if you're playing with VJ, for example, you're in one context. If you're playing with one set of drums versus another set of drums, it's another context. And what I find certainly is there's a lot of very immediate sensory feedback that comes in through touch, like, and the sense of touch here is like transmitted. It's not directly, unless you're playing hand drums, it's coming through something else into like this touch receptors in your hand, and you have to instantly get that feedback that goes and is mixed with your auditory feedback to then tell you, that worked. That got the sound I wanted. That got the spacing between the eighth notes that I wanted. You have to kind of incorporate that. So your brain is like pulling together many different sensory impulses. Yeah. And then somewhere, who knows where? I mean, does anyone know where? There's the recognition that, okay, these are the right, I'm responding with my premotor plan in my head to then control the muscles in the way I want to play the ride cymbal this way versus that way.
Yeah, all of that. There's a lot happening in real time. Yeah. And especially when you deal with, especially when it comes to playing in different rooms, a lot of times you're playing drums in rooms that weren't meant to have drums in them.
Yes.
So you kind of like, it's like a constant, I don't say struggle or like a fight, but you're kind of going against the grain because it's like you're not meant to be in here. They made this room for like, strings and like 500 years ago. And now you're playing a drum set, something that didn't even exist back then in the context that, it's just kind of more 20th century rhythm section, So... And I've experienced that a lot, especially like in Europe, because a lot of older venues and stuff. So, you really have to deal, you have to make it work. So that's the thing.
I'm wondering, Jennifer, if you could tell us from your experience, because you were a musician first and then kind of came into the field where you are now. How did that change your perception as a performer later? Because I know you still perform and you still kind of in that world, kind of being connected to what you do now and studying the brain and studying mind, and how much did that affect you as a musician, like going back and saying, okay, am I doing this, what's happening here, what am I doing, how's this responding, what's happening in my head while I'll do this, that kind of thing?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a good answer, but I'll improv something. I took a long hiatus off my playing. I played when I was in college. I was in symphony orchestra. I played with every group imaginable during college. And then when I left college, I was still playing a little bit, musical theater and stuff like that, but I became an orchestra manager. So when I moved here to New York to manage an orchestra, that took up all my time. So I kind of stopped playing. I was associated with some of the really top orchestral musicians and studio musicians in the city and rented a lot of their percussion equipment, but I never played. And then I thought I was going to go back to that, but then somehow ended up in the corporate world forever, and then made it here. And the interesting thing is that being in this department, because surrounded by so many wonderful creative people, I got back to playing music. So really going back to science brought me back to music. And it was interesting because the pressure was off. I wasn't trying to be a professional musician anymore. And I was a lot older and more mature. And so my practicing became a lot more confident. I was able to, this idea of touch and proprioception is something that really came into mind. The way I was trained in college, my teacher, Pat Smith, up in New Haven, was very much about touch. And his teacher Fred Hinger was the principal timpanist of the Metropolitan Opera in Philadelphia.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'm a Hinger disciple.
Okay.
Only drummers would know this stuff.
The Hinger timpanis and Hinger snares and all that stuff. Some of the best.
Yeah. I actually studied with Fred for a week during my senior year of college, which was an honor. So, sorry, this is going into interesting territories.
Drum geek stuff.
But one of the things, and so now I can put it into a little bit more scientific terms as far as like understanding touch and space. My teacher used to have me do exercises where you go and you literally try to stop right before the drum and not hit it. And I spent hours in a practice room doing like this. And so now I can think about like why that training was important. And it's interesting. One ordinarily thinks of this sense of where you are in space, proprioception, as really rather innate. But I know I had to train it. So I'm not a motor system person, so I'm really curious to hear when we get into the discussion portion, like how that works. Because I'm very interested in the lines between innate and learned behaviors and memory. So, I think it's really all very blurred. We try to put them in their boxes because it's easier to analyze scientifically, but I think there's a lot of crossover, and I'm very curious to hear from everyone in the audience their ideas about how that works, because I'm not a specialist in that crossover.
Great. So let's open it up. I would love to hear thoughts and impressions, specific questions about anything. I know we have some folks here visiting, and if you have any questions or thoughts, yeah.
Can I give you a microphone?
No, it doesn't matter. I have a question I'm dying to ask, but before I ask it, can you guys play one more time?
Of course. Want us to play now? I mean, we're planning to play at the end.
That's the first question.
I think we should
hear you guys.
I think we should take a question and then play. But we will play. We will play.
Okay. All right. So it's a question. It's a question specifically for the two drummers. So, and actually this happened a little bit when you were just playing solo, but let's take like a simpler example where maybe you're playing with a combo, maybe it's straight ahead jazz, just swing jazz, and then you've got a solo, right? And so you're starting, I can hear where the pulse is, I can hear where the phrasing is, I get totally lost in the middle, and then you like bring me back at the end, right? In fact, in the middle, I've definitely lost track of the phrasing.
Wait, you're talking about if you're playing or if you're just listening?
So that's part of the question. So for me as a listener, I've definitely lost track of the phrasing, and I've sometimes even lost track of even where the pulse is. Mm-hmm. I'm still hearing these like interesting little motifs. It's not like I'm completely lost, right? Yeah. There's these like little motifs that become stronger than the pulse itself in a sense. But I'm assuming you were counting all the way through. But I don't know. or that I mean, like if we put a metronome on you that like had the form, maybe even had like if it's AABA in there, had the bridge in there, like would you be coming back like right after the exact right number of pulses, like right on target? Or does that not matter? It's like part of the fun getting lost in some interesting bunch of like rhythmic motifs, and then it just gels back wherever it needs to gel at the end back into 4/4 time. Or does that depend on your mood or the drummer or like?
There's a lot of factors.
Okay.
Context.
Yeah. There's all kinds of.
So you do both of those things?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because sometimes we're playing. We might play something that might have a very specific structure in terms of like the melody or the theme or whatever. But then it can kind of open up sometimes, right? Other times there's a theme statement or a structure, and we kind of keep that same form as we go the whole way. So even then, I'm never really counting though. I'm just I might sing the melody in my head, or I'm keeping the form in a different kind of way, but I don't usually use.
But you're thinking about the phrase and the pulse, not necessarily counting numbers. But it's, I know what you mean. It's like we're thinking about
literally.
Yeah.
But you know where you are in the form at every moment.
I also think it depends on the situation. Like, for example, like the question you asked is very common in a jazz context, where like I might play and then Marcus will kind of respond and play 4 bars or whatever, 8 bars or within a space of time. But also as I'm listening, I might notice that he started playing something that's not necessarily in the pulse, and then I'm going, okay, so he's not doing that anymore, right? So he's just and it's it's kind of like on him. He might decide, and all the great jazz albums in history have this, right? And it's the drummer might just go and Tony Williams and Elvin Jones and Roy Haynes, they might just now I'm gonna go and do this thing, and then at some point I'll bring you back. So that comeback is kind of what I'm listening for. At that point, I'm not thinking, are we in the 4th bar? I'm kind of like, he's gonna bring me back, and I'm just gonna listen for that. And if he was playing on the form, it's almost the same. Whereas like I'm kind of listening for a pulse, but at the same time, I'm not really counting like a metronome. Like, okay, this is where it is, and because if I did that and we don't have the same metronome, then we're not gonna be together. So it's more like I'm counting related to what he's playing, So it's like he's kind of giving me his thing, his pulse, and then I'm kind of reacting to that. So I think a lot of it is that, and it's a great question because it's like what happens in that time. We're like, are we trying to follow something or not? Most of the time we are, but it's not always like a set pulse, I guess.
Yeah, I think the one place where you end up having to count is like if you're performing for the first time, like with a big band, and there's a set chart in front of you, and then I would agree with Marcus, I wouldn't necessarily be counting the measures, but I would be singing in my head. I'd be doing a replay of like the melody or the groove and stuff, and then end up going off from there.
Yeah, the only time I really count in musical context, musical situation, was if I had, playing my European classical days, or if I had to play a triangle in like the 400th measure or something like that, and I'd be like, all right, I might count some measures. I got 400 right here.
I have a plug for that. I have a concert on Sunday with a symphony orchestra, and we're playing Prokofiev's Violin Concerto No. 2, and the bass drum part, like I have to count. I have to count.
It's unfortunate sometimes because nobody wants to count to 400, but sometimes I would find other ways to kind of get
there. That's Sibelius.
Sometimes in the parts they would have little cues, and so you just kind of, that's like your mnemonic device. Instead of having to count 400 bars, you could just say, well, when I hear this, that means I got 18 bars to go until I come.
But if you miss
that, or if they miss it, and you don't get
it. If they miss it,
then
you're done.
So
you have to count.
Or you could just learn it, just memorize it. Which I've done too. If it's something that I really like, it's easier to memorize. But like, if it's a piece I'm not really crazy about, I'm not gonna,
cool,
waste my memory on something I don't really like.
Any other questions or comments from anyone? Come on. Yeah.
Oh, can I encourage you? This is not very long. I may have to ask you to stand. Thank you.
Just wondering about the kit, and it has this standard structure, which I don't really know where it came from, and I don't know what the alternatives are, but where did it come from, and how often do you want to use something different than a standard kit?
Where did the structure of this kit come? Like, where the foundations of this drum set?
I think he means like the drum set.
The drum set, yeah. It's a combination of other things. You have a snare. Usually, there's a snare drum that's a focal part of it, and a bass drum. And nowadays, there's a hi-hat. In the beginning, hi-hat came a little later. In the very early days, there were no hi-hats. And there were like variations of hi-hats. Like there was a low boy at one point, which is kind of like this, but it was really low. It was like down here. And then at some point, they modified it to become what they call a hi-hat. And then I would say like the main foundation of a drum set is usually a bass drum, snare, hi-hat, and some type of cymbal. Then you could add more cymbals or more toms to accentuate. But the general core is like the kick or the bass drum, snare, and hi-hat. These days, at least, that's what I would say is the core. And the hi-hat, I feel like, was popularized in the 30s. Papa Joe Jones was known as Mr. Hi-Hat. So, there were some drummers like in the 20s that were playing the low boys, but a lot of the really early drummers, like for instance, there was one guy named Baby Dodds from New Orleans who was born in the late 1800s. And once the low boy came out, and then eventually the hi-hat came out, he just wasn't a fan of it. So he kind of just played without a hi-hat pretty much his whole life, which, you know, was kind of typical when he first started playing. But like after the modern day drum set started developing more, pretty much everybody, especially after Papa Joe Jones, played with hi-hats as well. But he never really incorporated it in his style. But he's like one of the original drum set players. So yeah. Oh yeah. No, you know, this is kind of seen as like a standard 4-piece kit. So this is usually what you'll get, something along these lines, different types of woods, different sizes maybe, but for the most part, these, you know, bass drum, snare drum, hi-hat, 1 or 2 cymbal stands, usually 2 toms, one that's on the bass drum and one that's on the floor typically. But I like to move things around, and yeah, I typically, though, always have a hi-hat, snare, and bass drum, though. That's usually something that's in all of my setups.
I was wondering, Marcus, kind of related to that question, if you could talk just a little bit, because I was telling Jennifer about this, the devices, the software that you use sometimes, that kind of, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I guess that might be good to talk to a bunch of scientists. A friend of mine who I met in high school in one of these programs that we were in, he's a drummer. He actually, I think he went to Columbia. I don't know what he went for. I don't know if it was for engineering or not, but he basically, you know, after he graduated, not so long after, he hit me up out of the blue one day and told me that he was working on developing software to incorporate electronics, but from the drum set. So it's not like something that we would have to do on the computer separate from the drums. Like we can actually play the drums or apply all the information that we have, all the understanding that we have on the drums, and kind of translate it into electronics. And he basically came up with this company. It's called Sunhouse, and people think that they're triggers, but they're actually sensors. They're a bit more sophisticated than the typical trigger, which would you know, it would trigger a sound when you hit the drum. If there's a trigger on the drum, it would trigger that sound. But these sensors are a bit more sophisticated. So with this particular setup that he invented, there's basically, you can map out sounds on this software that he has. The sensor attaches to the rim of the drum, and the drum is broken up into, I don't know if it's like 8 or 12 different sections, and you could program sounds for different regions of the instrument. And it gets really deep because then there's a lot of layers to it. You can add as many sounds as you want to the same region or other regions. You can change the sounds according to the timbre or the velocity, or sometimes even the speed. You can do a lot of things with programming. And every time you play it, you kind of have to train it to your touch and your feel. So if I wanted to hook up a sensor to this drum, I would have to train it so it knows when I'm hitting the center, when I'm hitting the edge, when I'm hitting the rim with the top of my stick, when I'm hitting the rim with the middle of my stick, when I hit the side of the drum. If I want to do a cross stick thing or anything, it kind of knows what to look for when Marcus plays that versus somebody else comes down. They can train it in their own way. It's really nuanced and it's really sophisticated, but it's revolutionary.
So it's like an extension of the drum set, really, but it's also reacting to your touch.
Yes, which is really big because that wasn't happening, and also to be able to get to program that many sounds just for one drum. You know, I've done gigs where you can use up to 4 sensors at a time, but I've done gigs with just 1 or 2, and you can just do so much with just that, and how they interact, how they talk to each other. There's a lot you can do with programming in that. So it's a really revolutionary program that he invented.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think we had a question in the back or a comment.
Thanks. So, Miguel, you're talking about pulse, the importance of pulse, and that. Thank you, Eric. I don't want to infect you to be known as the person who got Eric Kandel sick, but that will be the end of my career. So you have pulse on the one hand, which is like this steady beat, but then, Marcus, when you were playing, it looked like you had 5 different rhythms going on at once. Your 2 hands were doing different rhythms, your feet were doing different rhythms, but you've got the pulse. And I think it's impossible for the brain to do something like that. So, you know, how do you learn to separate out all those different types of muscles, the different arms, how are going to maintain that different rhythm. When if I was playing the drums, I'd have a really hard time doing one rhythm. But so is that something you consciously learn, or is that something intuitive, or a mixture of the two?
It's definitely a mixture, but it takes requires practice. And for me, I always felt like that's one of the beauties of playing this instrument, the drum set, because you have all your limbs going, or you can have all your limbs going at the same time. And so you can really kind of, you can kind of really evoke the spirit of multiple people playing at the same time. You know what I mean? Or like, you can kind of create a space where there are multiple melodies. It's a very harmonic instrument. It's not so linear. Or it can be. It really depends on how you want to approach it. But it has the potential to do these things, playing things that maybe 1,000 years ago would take 4 or 5 people to play. You can do it all at one time. And you can kind of move these things around in a very specific way, because ultimately it's one person conducting all of these different rhythms. So I thought that was I always thought that was one of the beauties of this instrument. And so I kind of spent more time investigating that and, really sitting with that and trying to find ways to bring these ideas that I have and, bring them to the actual kit. Spend time with it. For me, I never had I would say that I never really had a shortage of inspiration or ideas. For me, it was always like trying to find ways to catch up with the ideas that I had, because it's a lot. My mind is always, I'm always thinking about something, I'm always feeling things, hearing things, but then I have to find a way to physically try to get it out, and that's part of the thing. So
I can definitely relate to that, because especially at this stage where I am completely out of practice on drum kit, on more classical percussion, I'm up to speed. But what I find is like I have a lot of ideas or things I hear, but like I can't do them now. But when back in the day when I was playing kit, it took like you do a lot of very repetitive things. I'm assuming you've done like the same like exercises, like getting around the drums, and you do like working independently, working together, so that the muscle memory almost becomes a set of habits that you can just almost subconsciously then later pick out when you're actually performing. But the time in the practice room, at least for me, a lot of it was spent like really just an hour doing this, and you just spend the time, and then it becomes second nature after that.
Yeah, I think any musician would relate to this thing that you guys were talking about, in terms of like connecting the creative with the actual act of performing it, right? Which is like, and a lot of times what happens is like, if you're exposed to a lot of music and you're checking out a lot of music, it's like, okay, I need the instrument to catch up with what I have to say, right?
Yes.
Which is sort of like the curse that we live with for the rest of our lives, pretty much. It's always like, okay, let me just kind of like train myself to be able to express what, especially if you're doing something creative, right? If you're improvising or like trying to put ideas out, and I feel like in this sense, it's like that connection with like sort of like the creative part of it, which is informed by sources of information and all these things. The muscle memory thing that you were talking about, I was talking about this with Paula the other day too, this idea of like, repetitive things that kind of happen just by doing them over and over again, like an athlete, right? And then the combination of the two, which is like, okay, I need to use the tool that I have now, the saxophone or the percussion or the drum set, to connect with this. And that's really what takes a lot of time, right? So it's like you practice this, the repetition, and then you kind of gather information, and then the transfer is really where like a lot of the work is in a lot of times, for at least especially when you're a creative musician and you're dealing with improvisation and those types of things. Yeah. Any other questions? Mike.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. And no question in my mind that the pulse is ultimately sort of the foundation of all of aesthetics, because it's all about tension and release, and we all feel the beat and anticipate when it's coming. But I want to expand on Steve's point. It's not so much the impossibility, but the challenge to neuroscience that you pose. So you do it in two ways. You're referring to the independence of the different, your different limbs and also the different parts of the instrument. But I think people need to realize that I think in rough sort of back in the envelope calculation style, that your brain is has to initiate the movement that you are going to start with your stick, maybe from the hi-hat to when you do those cross rhythms, about an eighth note at the metronome speed of 300 beats per second. So I'm in round numbers, 100 milliseconds. Okay, so and the thing is that depending on whether you're going from the hi-hat to the tom-tom, or whether you're going from the small tom to the larger one, that's a different distance, and depending on the dynamics that you need, that's a different amount of time and a different amount of a deceleration before you hit the drum, depending on how loud you want to be, and so on and so forth. And I think that it's a challenge to us, the neuroscientists in the room, that to figure out how you could possibly do it. And I think you can possibly. I have the proof. So, we did an experiment, and we now know that it is possible. But I wonder if Daniel Walpert would speak to this. It's the kind of thing that he studies. What are the actual? There must at some point be a limitation. I mean, even.
Oh yeah, look, I can't play half the things I hear. I truly mean that. Like I hear. I think I only can kind of get to like maybe 50% of the things that I actually hear. It's kind of frustrating to know that you're like chilling around 50% of like what you're actually going for, but it's all relative, right? I mean,
but if you can't hear half the things you play, then you need to see an audiologist.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might want to chip in. No.
Thanks, Mike. No, the thing which I think is fascinating is the fact that now senses of proprioception and touch are all very important, but they're incredibly slow, so that you only get them a fifth of a second or a tenth of a second after the event. So you really can't be controlling
touch. Sorry? You're talking about touch right now?
I'm talking about touch or proprioception, like the signal of where your arm is in space.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to wait till you felt your arm was at the drum before you stopped that movement, you couldn't stop it in time. Right. So prediction is really important.
Oh yeah.
You have to learn to predict ahead on these proprioceptive and sensory signals to know what they're going to be in the future, because you need to act in advance to stop, for example, that. So that's a very hard thing to do. And that's something which we think you have to learn to predict how your body responds to your commands. That's, I think, one of the vital things. When you're moving so fast between things, you can't be using sensory information, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot, at least in this, what we like to call like the African-American classical music, or, some people call it jazz or whatever, that there's actually a lot of prediction, or like, kind of, it's weird because in one sense, there's a lot of improvisation, right? So we all have to be present with that. But at the same time, there is kind of like a psychic quality in it. Not just talking about prediction of like when you want to play certain things, but just like kind of hearing what's coming next, like kind of hearing it in real time. And I feel like that's one of the, it's a lot to have a conversation with somebody and you're both talking at the same time. I've heard it said that this is like one of the only times where that actually is encouraged. Yeah, because, when we're talking, you don't want people talking on top of each other. And I'm not saying that we're talking on top of each other, but we are talking at the same time and listening and responding. And that's just two of us. If it's like a quartet, there's a lot happening at the same. It's really, it requires a lot of a lot of energy and a lot of concentration for a focus, and there's a lot of elements to it. It's like all the neural stuff happening. It's like the spiritual aspect of it, it's just a lot going on at the same time.
Out of curiosity, since you mentioned it, I mean, the cocktail party effect, when 5 people are talking, it's very hard. Do you have the cocktail party effect when you play in a band, or can you really hear everyone individually?
It depends on what kind of band it is. It does, right? I mean,
I think for the context of music that we're talking about, a lot of times is about like it's almost like, I feel at least that every instrument kind of have it has a responsibility, you know, like you know, and then there's layers of things that kind of pop into like some kind of protagonism, you know, and then you kind of focus on that. Or like, you know, if I'm a bass player and I'm playing with Marcus, I'm probably focusing on his time and his cymbal beat, and you know, if he plays, and then I'm at the same time I'm listening to the pianist and the chords he plays or she plays and trying to react to that. And the same thing if I'm a drummer, I might be reacting to the pianist or to the saxophonist or vocalist, and this kind of passed around. So it is everyone playing at the same time, but it's like almost like layers of protagonism, I guess. That's the way I would think of it. You know, it's almost like things kind of step in and out of the limelight, maybe. But thanks, Daniel. That was awesome.
Yeah, Daniel Wolfer, everybody. I think speaking of time,
yeah, we should play one more tune.
Sure.
Yeah. We'll play a tune that we really like by another musician that we really love. Before we do that, once again, Marcus Gilmore. And Jennifer Scribner. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you all for being here. This is so awesome. Every time we get to do one of these, it just feels, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. We're going to play a song by Joe Henderson. This is called Y Todavía La Quiero.
what is that recording? What do you record that? Is that like the late
Relaxing the camera. Yeah, check.
Yeah, right.
Relaxing the camera. I think it's early 80s.
Early 80s, right? Okay.
Miguel Zenón, Marcus Gilmore, everybody. Thank you so much again to Jen Scribner. Thank you all for coming. You're welcome. There's some food and snacks outside. It's still a beautiful day, so we can also go out on the terrace if we want to. Thanks for hanging out with us, everybody. And Miguel will definitely be back for one